So my name is Daniel. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Architecture, Art and Design at the University in Minho. And together with Nancy Colling, a senior researcher at the ETH in Zurich and associate professor of projects and planning at the Bergen School of Architecture in Norway, we will be sharing this keynote session with cooking sections. Cooking sections is a London-based practice established in 2013 by Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alan Schwaber that utilizes food as well as a lens and a tool to observe landscapes undergoing transformation. Through site-responsive installations, performance, and video, their interdisciplinary approach delves into the interconnected realms of art, architecture, ecology, and politics. In their practice, cooking sections have explored diverse topics and geographies. From the politics of food trade in their 2016 project, The Empire Remains, which departs from the English colonial empire to question new geographies of our post-colonial planet. Their work has extended to the connections between color perception, natural, man-made environments, and food consumptions in a 3-chapter piece named When Salmon, 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 presented in several venues such as the Tate Britain in 2022, managing to remove farmed salmon from the menus across many cultural institutions and introduce climavore dishes instead. And more recently, they've delved into the interconnections between the production of milk, buffalo milk, in the Istanbul water buffaloes, and the threatened wetland ecologies in Wallow Lands, a project that was commissioned for the 17th Istanbul Biennale. One of their most notable and known initiatives, Climavore, is a long-term project built in cooperation with many agents and institutions that sets out to envision seasons of food production and consumption that react to man-induced climate events and landscape alterations. Different from now obsolete Eurocentric cycles of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, Climavore rethinks the construction of space and infrastructure by focusing on how climate alterations offer a new set of clues to adapt our diet to them. From the Climavore Jamil Institute Research Initiative, they are currently senior research fellows and principal investigators at the Royal College of Art in London. Their work has been presented in renowned venues such as the Serpentine Gallery, SALT, HKW, the Storefront for Art and Architecture, as well as in the Venice and Shanghai Biennales, or the Los Angeles Public Art Triennales, the Sharjah Architecture and Art Triennales, Manifest, and many more. Recognized for their significant contributions, they have been nominated for the Turner Prize in 2021 and awarded a special prize at the 2019 Future Generation Art Prize. They were also nominated for the Visible Award for Social Engaging Practices, and Daniel received in 2020 the Harvest GSD Real Rights Prize for the project entitled Being Shellfish. From colonial resources to seaweed, mussels, salmon, invasive species, water species, sorry, it's feedback. Okay. Water systems, fertilization, soil, buffalo milk, wetlands, and many more. Cooking sections have helped us read and act on our built and unbuilt environment through the way we feed our bodies as humans. On behalf of the organization team of the Uncertain Landscapes International Congress, Nancy and I thank Daniel and Alan for contributing to this event by presenting their work of cooking sections with us today. So, Alan, we have almost 1 hour and a half, and then we'll have half an hour in the end for debate. Okay, so just give me a minute while I'll shift to your presentation, okay?
Hello, everyone. We couldn't hear Daniel, so I hope you hear us.
Yes, we do. I'll just turn off the microphone, otherwise you don't get feedback. I don't know, okay? Okay.
Right.
Okay, so thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for being there. I'm Daniel.
I'm Alon.
And we work as Cooking Sections, which is a practice based in London that we started 10 years ago. And today for this Uncertain Landscapes gathering, we thought to present different projects within the Climavore framework that will respond to the different seasons and the different layers that come with them. Let me share screen. Now, you see the slides? Hope you do.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Since the Industrial Revolution, and especially after World War II, seasons have been shifting at unexpected rates. In central India, longer dry periods and more extreme monsoon-related events are affecting the grain harvest.
Hotter winters in the east coast of the US deprive trees of the chill hours they require to bear stone fruit.
Dry spells in the rainy season in Ghana and Ivory Coast are threatening cocoa supply in the world's top producing countries.
In Europe, the first day of spring has advanced by 6 to 8 days in the past 30 years. Wine harvest in Burgundy, France now starts in mid-August, almost a month earlier than a few decades ago.
Signs that once allowed humans to organize life around seasons have become instead indicators of crisis.
They expose new waves of global weirding or season creep. Birds laying their eggs almost a month too early, or trees retaining green canopies for longer, is not an evidence of just global warming anymore. This isn't cli-fi. This is not climate fiction. These are the real muted landscapes featuring the tropicalization of California or the Mediterraneization of the Black Sea.
Unexpected weather is not a new phenomenon. Since the Neolithic, human appetite, the desire to eat food and nourish our metabolic needs, has guided evolution through our ancestors' efforts to understand the sun, connect to the moon, respect the tides, and read the stars, to be weather.
It goes something like this. If dandelions fall tightly, expect rain.
When seagulls fly high, clear skies.
When sheep gather in a huddle, tomorrow you'll have a paddle.
All these popular wisdom had just one mission: to forecast seasonal tasks and plan when best to source food, gather, sow, harvest, herd, fish, hunt, or reproduce. But seasonal knowledge no longer works for its original purpose.
As traditional seasons creep, we recognize that reducing our footprint by eating less industrial meat protein, more locally grown produce, or plant-based dishes is crucial, but perhaps not enough.
To be omnivore is the unique trait of humans, the capacity to choose what to eat. But a wide range of foods, so central to our physiological and cultural development, has mutated into the opposite. It has actually narrowed our interactions with food systems towards off-the-shelf ready-mades. A metabolic rift has separated the soil from what it means to culture it, to grow food and to nourish both ground and bodies.
In 2015, we coined the term climivore to describe how to adapt our foodscapes to new human-made seasons, moving beyond a carnivore, omnivore, locavore, vegetarian, or vegan diet into climivore, a way of eating according to seasons of drought and moving deserts, polluted seas, and wetland disappearance, infertile soil and fertilizer runoff.
Seasons are eroding, but to keep up, supermarkets have been flooded with an endless supply of standardized food items all year round. Such omnipresent products have in fact diminished the diversity of food produced in a standardized environment, regardless of climatic events.
The same strawberries in winter.
The same apples in the summer.
And the same bananas, the same.
the same farmed salmon in the same shade of salmon pink all year round.
This vicious loop makes seasons even more erratic. The more industries extend seasonality,
the more seasons shift.
And the more seasons shift,
the more industries introduce technological solutions to fix a global food system that they themselves are pushing to the brink of collapse.
This happens all around us, in our home, grocery shops, supermarkets, canteens, or restaurants.
Yet these spaces at the intersection between growers and consumers, farmers and eaters, hold the key to transform the food system.
Going back to the origins of the word restaurant can show us a new approach. The word restaurant originates from bouillon restaurant, an establishment in 18th century France that literally translates as restorative soup, named after a quasi-medicinal specialty dish intended to warm and nourish people's bodies. In the climate emergency, the restaurant, alongside school canteens, collective kitchens, and so many other feeding spaces in museums, cultural and educational institutions, all need to become a place not only to restore the human body, but also a venture to care for the planet's ecology. And as we will see today in the different projects that we will discuss, a way to promote systems that grow regenerative food while cultivating habitat.
Season of moving deserts. Employed by the Arabian American Oil Company, engineer James Mandeville spent years in Saudi Arabia negotiating with herders over the value of camels killed in oil field stumps. These contested encounters with desert dwellers throughout the 1960s, when he was working in the area, over the fair compensations, as they called them, led him to write one of the few modern treatises in English about Bedouin ethnobotany in the region, trying to protect perhaps what he knew his work was slowly annihilating.
Deserts for non-desert people are nothing but lack, absence, and non-being. Stereotypical Western representation of desert regions from the Sahara to the Atacama and the Negev commonly depict them as dead or empty landscapes, impossible to contain with little or no vegetation, and lack of access to water suitable only to keep nuclear secrets or the like. Even the verb to desert in several European languages refers to the act of leaving and being disloyal when most needed. Political scientist Afula Akumu tells us that part of the desert in African societies were even conceived and maintained as active buffer zones of separation between different peoples prior to the arrival of European colonial regimes. And not only in the African continent was the desert problematized.
Since the popularization of the term desertification after World War II, it became a political tool to control both space and people. Inhabitants from arid regions did not just suffer from aridity, they knew how to flexibly adapt with the seasons. Desert landscapes like the one we have here from northern Tunisia were not just shaped to be fertile like the microclimates used in the photograph. They were built also over time.
Bedouins in the Arabian Peninsula do not refer to their living space as a desert. They call it simply al-bar, the land, and so many other peoples whose homelands are arid. Societies living in these ecosystems have historically reduced their challenges through diverse mobility and cultural strategies, which were effective thanks to a vast reservoir of symbiotic knowledge.
Bedouin interactions with botany shows us also the necessary role of plants their essential oils and nutrients for living with the desert and its climate beyond the current geopolitical borders and wars that separate them.
Turning their backs to the desert, megacities around the Gulf have since fueled new green imaginaries, mimicking impossibly lush, heavily irrigated urban landscapes. Such oases are dropping groundwater levels and also pushing seawater to invade freshwater reserves.
The desert can bloom, but not with heavily irrigated plants. And contrary to the water-dependent ornamentals, as they are called, alternative desert gardens can learn from algorithmic discoveries in desert symbiosis, which reveal how plants are already organizing themselves collectively to reduce water stress and overcome extinction. As rainfall drops, sparse vegetation increases, following specific patterns whose density humans are only beginning to understand. And here you have some of these examples where these formations of the growth of the grasses in a way can be traced according to the different water flows increasing or decreasing.
The spotlight labyrinths or labyrinthic patterns of plant clusters in shrublands or different forms of salt-tolerant plant association, for example, also act as early warning indicators. They make it possible to predict a drop in groundwater reserves. Could these patterns help identify signs of recovery after a drought? Or even further, could understanding deserts deeply from the inside revolutionize human habitation in such environments?
Desert plants have been used by Bedouins for edible or medicinal purposes to live with the desert long before the engineer Mandeville already communicated them to the Western reader in English. Salt-tolerant desert species like cedar, tamarind, miswak, babool, or salt marsh greens, they are all equipped to populate urban areas around the Gulf and the surroundings, where we started working in 2019. And after collecting seeds from the deserts, we propagated and planted them into a new landscape carved in an abandoned site using demolition rubble to create 9 microclimates that provide shading, retain moisture, and in some also are able to water with the stones. And here you have an aerial shot of the garden, the desert garden that was made for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial.
In 2019, we created the Climavore Desert Food Garden, a microclimate developed in Sharjah, UAE, in collaboration with local plant ecologists and environmental engineers, to prepare for more extreme and unpredictable weather events there and, of course, elsewhere. Seasons of intense desertification, like periods of extreme drought, leading to permanent loss of vegetation cover, are becoming more prevalent across the world. And through these 9 microclimates that were shaped like bowls, basically using the different kind of desert plants that grow in the region of Sharjah and the UAE, we tried to see how basically we could water with stones, how we could create condensation by creating both shading and a difference in temperature between outside and inside the bowl, and allow a desert garden to bloom without watering it with water.
And the whole project was done in collaboration with AKT2, which is an environmental engineering group based in London as well. And then we also collaborated with local agronomists from the UAE, with Professor Ali El-Keblawi. And first we were, as we were saying, propagating the seeds from the desert because they did not exist in local nurseries. They are not considered part of the city, so people don't plant them in their gardens. And that was the first challenge, how to source the seeds. Then we created this landscape topography that you see here with the different bowls and depressions, like different microclimates. and then planted all of these seeds, most of them are edible or are used in different edible processes. And slowly, you see here over the 3 years that the garden has been there, how the different species took over. And you could see the differences in shading, humidity, moisture, with the different angles and also the materials that were used to cover and keep the moisture in the ground, like this recycled material from the demolition site, or the actual rubble that you see in the other images that was also taken from a demolition site next door. And then also we had sensors inside and outside each one of these 9 microclimates that were monitoring the performance of the different desert species over time. Unexpected droughts are far from being over, quite the opposite. Such periods may last for decades. And in the meantime, the challenge for all of us is how to mind the desert and think of its full potential in bringing arid space back to life.
Season of drought. We associate drought with high heat and water scarcity. The lack is sometimes constructed and isn't necessarily about who has the most, but who needs the least. Following the slow but firm steps of an octogenarian resident of Pantelleria, a volcanic island midway between Sicily and Tunisia, we were taken into an extraordinary dry stone open sky enclosure to taste moon lemons, their name of a local citrus that is to remind you how it bears fruit every lunar month. A year-round supply of precious juice in an arid yet incomprehensibly fertile island.
Not long after Scottish surgeon James Lind's scientific proof of the effective use of vitamin C in treating scurvy, the disease, which was a property known empirically by sailors for centuries, oranges and lemons experienced unprecedented worldwide demand. The economy of Sicily, the largest Mediterranean island, and also a key historical hub for the citrus trade, boosted. And so did the infrastructures required to harvest them. Its Arab and Persian influenced infrastructure of tunnels, cisterns, and terraces to channel and retain water in drought-prone territory with seasonal torrential rains swept by the dry Sirocco winds from the Sahara actually evolved into the development of complex water technologies to squeeze every drop from the air and the soil. And here you see one of these many tunnels that cross the city of Palermo underneath to bring not only water from the mountains into the city for centuries, but also fresh air. In waterless islands like Pantelleria, as we were saying before, which is off the coast of Sicily, dry irrigation methods consisted in the construction of the so-called Giardino Pantescu microclimates, which are dry stone structures to water citrus groves without water. And here you can see the classical typology, which is this circular dry stone, like around 2 to 3 meters high and around 0.5 to 1 meter thick, to create those microclimates for a single citrus tree.
Their ingenuity relies on a thick stone perimeter that absorbs humidity from the air. Due to the temperature difference between the outer and the inner sides of the wall, they condense water droplets to extend the growing season. Helped by this unique dew harvesting technique, the temperature gradient aids to provide moisture for both the enclosed tree and the soil. Without that confinement for humidity and wind protection, the precious citrus trees inside would never fruit, as the island lacks freshwater sources.
With circular, rectangular, polygonal, or simply irregular layout, some of these structures date back to the 15th century, but many have fallen into disrepair, and only a few hundred still stand in place in Pantelleria. Their capacity to water without water allowed its inhabitants to be more resilient to climate change, but also to organized crime. As dry irrigation turned Sicily and the surroundings into a hydraulic society, we could say, with booming exports of citrus fruits, it also at the same time created unrivaled water dependencies that laid the foundations of the Sicilian mafia with ties across Italy, but also abroad. And hiring mafia affiliates for private protection and mediation between citrus retailers and exporters, as well as private and public rights over water springs, became indeed a common practice. So avoiding both scurvy, but also extortion, as well as protecting your lemons from petty thieves, were the reasons why it was definitely worth to invest your family savings in a stone wall without a roof.
Different techniques have been used worldwide to create microclimates in water-scarce territories and support dry-land farming. These range from the Afage gravity system in Oman and the Pequíos in Peru to collective irrigation channels such as the Ezequias in Spain, Amuna structures to slow down water runoff in the Andes, Sunni gardens in Arizona, or buried clay water containers that keep the ground moist in Rajasthan or Burkina Faso. Despite the threat of erasure, these systems, like the gardens in Pantelleria, keep being used for their original purpose, perhaps more needed than ever before when confronted with a perennial season of drought.
The fact that most of the driest winters since the beginning of the 20th century around the Mediterranean Sea have been experienced in the past 2 decades only shows us that the heat frontier, or these aridity lines, are moving northwards in this geography, increasing pressure on irrigation costs, but also demand for so-called affordable tomatoes and oranges.
Climavore explores alternative agriculture practices to combat increasing drought and political extortion, ultimately proposing how to emancipate trees from water. In temperate climates, we tend to think of the summer as the dry season. But what happens when rain scarcity stays year-round, lasting beyond the growing cycle? How do we source produce in a decade-long season of droughts? Areas in southern Italy have coped with drought for centuries, but it is areas further north that once they are now panicking, lacking perhaps the knowledge, infrastructure, or plant diversity to face new climatic changes.
In what is above is what is below, which was our contribution to Manifesta 12 in Palermo, which was a biennial. We traced the unique irrigation structures built in Sicily and Pantelleria, making them into contemporary microclimate prototypes that we also implemented in Palermo based on the Giardino Pantesco model. The 3 microclimates were built in the city to sense and reduce water stress in existing citrus trees, which are subjected to ever-decreasing rainfall. And different from greenhouse bubbles that disconnect both sides of a glass enclosure from each other, these prototypes experimented with enhancing or harvesting natural water flows to be implemented in places over the duration of new seasons of drought. And here you can see one of the first microclimates that was made with these very standard bricks, just turned sideways to allow the breeze to go through, while again creating these shaded areas to try to keep moisture on the ground. Here you see the structure from the outside, around 5 citrus trees. The second The second one was made with agricultural nets hanging from quite high up, like around 20 meters high, that were also trying to shade a set of citrus trees in the center of Palermo. And the third one was around a mandarin tree made with these repurposed irrigation pipes that were abandoned on site. Also, we found them there from a previous system from the 1960s. And in this place that actually was a property confiscated from the mafia and opened up as a public space for the city. So those were the three microclimates.
In parallel, we also again worked here with sensors that were placed within and outside of the installation to, on the one hand, understand the effects of these microclimates on the trees, and also to see and kind of assess and sense how the trees were performing. So really kind of through these kind of enclosures and microclimates, trying to think about the performance of the trees through the duration of the biennial and the exhibition. For the duration of the biennial, we also collaborated with local restaurants in the city, featuring calimavore menus made from drought-resistant heritage ingredients, such as carob, tumenia, manna, capers, sesame, and artichokes, ancestral produce that do not need irrigation to thrive. They are the clue to begin to dismantling constructed water scarcity, moving into calimavore ways of watering without the water. With increased drought periods appearing along the Mediterranean, how can we adapt agroecological systems by embracing water scarcity?
And these projects around droughts that started in Sicily, now we are expanding across the south of Italy and France through monoculture meltdown, which is a project that we just started this year as part of a new research initiative that we started at the Royal College of Art in London called Climavore X Jamil at RCA, which is looking into farmers, seed keepers, agricultural practices, and also community initiatives that have developed structures, but also guarded seeds and developed crops that are not reliant on irrigation to thrive. And in an area governed by strict regulations and subsidies that prioritize standardized seeds and intensive monoculture, the project is that is led by anthropologist Enrico Milazzo, is working with farmers and cultural institutions on the ground to revitalize foodways that are resistant and resilient to drought. So to rethink the space of these cultivation areas through new approaches. And just a few weeks ago, we organized as part of that the first Climavore Assembly in Rome, which is the seat of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in the week of the World Food Forum. Yet the Climavore Assembly did not aim to be a mirror image of this intergovernmental bureaucracy, but to act as its defiant double. And it provisionally occupied centers of authority like the Museo delle Civiltà, the Museum of Civilizations of Rome, and Campidoglio, which is the seat of the city senate in Rome, and basically being aware of the complex and problematic histories within and around them. And we gathered there to think, to contend, to question our collective role as cultural producers, but also as farmers and policymakers, architects, activists, in addressing the broken food system and also our metabolic dependencies.
This requires reaffirming the bonds between culture and agriculture. The collective force that came together in Rome was made of growers, seed keepers, curators, cultivators, artists, community organizers, chefs, researchers, activists, architects, anthropologists, students, and policymakers. And between all of us, together, we were representing cooperatives, communities, museums, governments, cultural organizations, farmers, associations, and food collectives working to imagine an alternative world. As more and more chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and so many other sites are used in industrial agriculture, they have disconnected our guts from soil and water. For us, this is a key point, the need to start addressing the chemical toxicities that the farm and pharma industry have pushed through industrialized food chains that in turn have created a complete metabolic breakdown. And so the goal of the Climavore Assembly was to reconnect appetite with fields and metabolism with the underground.
The problem in agriculture and the landscapes that have been depleted because of the intensive character of it is, we believe, not only environmental or economic, it is a cultural issue and what we value. Culture and agriculture have been more and more disconnected from each other over the past decades, but climate struggles cannot be split from cultural shifts, and cultural shifts require new forms of action. And so we need to understand how to reconnect these two realms of culture and agriculture to rethink the future of the landscape.
Addressing the broken food systems is not only an economic or environmental issue. It affects our individual and collective body. By now, it is well established that monoculture in the field is monoculture of the mind, whether we're talking about tomatoes, wheat, lemons, and so on and so forth. And to transform this cultural struggle requires us to redefine the values that agriculture can cultivate, to see civic space in what enters our mouth.
Season of wetland disappearance.
On a spring walk between the coasts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, we cannot fathom the plans to dig a new shipping canal outside Istanbul, 4 times wider than the Panamas. This new canal, Istanbul, is projected to cut across the unique wetland landscape inhabited by water buffaloes for centuries. As part of the metropolitan expansion with the new airport and the planned development, it is going to dig and drain the historic wetlands outside the city.
Wetlands, mangroves, swamps, bogs, marshes, and mudfloods are incredibly rich habitats, but they have been drained to improve, or so-called improve, land for centuries, be it to impose monoculture farmland, to create real estate, to displace fugitive people avoiding state control, or to eradicate malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases for colonizers from the coasts of Italy and Sri Lanka to the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Mississippi. And over time, knowledge in this particular area around the outskirts of Istanbul was brought by Bulgarian herders who migrated to the area in Ottoman times, also followed by Greek Turks after the 1923 forced population exchange, which altogether over time created an extraordinary culinary heritage in unison with the wetland ecology of the area.
In the past decades, these liminal landscapes have been appreciated and legally recognized for being crucial migratory bird stopovers, useful filtering zones, and invaluable buffers against sea flooding. So will wetlands be the orchards of the future?
Also, as part of the Climavore X Jamilat RCA project that I was mentioning before, we are working in this site in Istanbul where pastoral practices still rely on the wetlands. And that is how, through the practices of herding, buffalo milk has been boosted as an essential ingredient in Turkish cuisine through freshly made kaymak, which is like clotted cream, or sütlaç, which is sort of rice pudding, or muhallebi, among the residents of Istanbul, but also their surroundings, and how the wetlands relies on the desert and the desert relies on the wetlands.
As the coal and peat mines that populated the outskirts of Istanbul shut down, buffalo found refuge in the ruins of the flooded pits, using them as wallows. Flooded depressions where buffalo liked to drink or bathe while they roam through the landscape.
A haven for these semi-wild animals, this environment is also an important bird migration flyway and also a vital place for buffalo-human interactions, including symbiotic exchanges with water, with birds, with frogs, with bacteria, with grasses, and many other species. Even the buffalo saliva fertilizes the soil as they graze.
But increasingly, threatened by urbanization and transport infrastructures, the murky land where the buffalo used to roam is no longer wet or available to them. It is not even technically considered a wetland anymore, since it is a landscape shaped by mining activity that lost its credentials of being nature.
Daniel, sorry, you live blocked in the big screen. Just give us a second so we can go back, okay?
Shall I stop sharing and start again?
Okay, can you just try talking to see if it works?
Yeah, you hear us all right?
Yeah, okay, you can go. Sorry for this technical problem.
No worries.
No worries.
Well, you might have missed some slides, but it's fine. So yeah, we were saying
so we were speaking about the buffalo landscapes and kind of how they have transformed from a mining site basically that was kind of abandoned and repurposed and kind of taken over by buffalo population. So the vast infrastructure that has drained the wetland have also shrunk the pastures and the traditional 7-day-long roaming routes to a mere day. New fences, barriers, embankments, and elevated roads have been draining the vicinity almost overnight. Indeed, the newly built international airport is encroaching the remaining herds into extinction. So could new ways of reconnecting with food from such threatened landscapes secure the permanence of herds, herders, and all other species depending on them? And here kind of you can see through the satellite image basically the transformation of the landscape. Prior to mining, a vast kind of dune landscape on the coast of the Marmara Sea that kind of over time gets first redeveloped kind of and mined, then abandoned. All of these green corridors emerging around those newly appeared wetlands, and basically all of the waterways and rivers and streams that existed there are kind of turned then into mines and then roaming and grazing areas.
And yeah, as part of the project that we're working with Merve Anil and Kubilay Ergelep, and the aim is to understand these encroachment of the grazing areas that you can see here in green. And this is like work in progress that we are developing for kind of a report in the study that we are making, so that it can also feed into the food strategy of the city and how to reconnect these areas that have been segregated through infrastructure, and how potentially through the role of herding and water buffaloes, we can rethink the commons or common grazing areas through corridors that preserve the whole ecology of the landscape of this post-mining or post-industrial landscape in place.
So what we put forward here, in other words, is how can a climavore diet enhance interactions across plant and animal species in a season of wetland draining?
Through a series of research surveys also that we have mentioned to ornithologists and water experts and botanists and conservationists and also ethnomusicologists, we have tried to chart the complex entanglements between all the inhabitants of the landscape, from human to also non-human, but always from a metabolic perspective, and how each one depends on whom for that digestion or nourishment in many different ways and scales. And we use the cultural promotion of buffalo milk for the very iconic desserts, which are very powerful in people's imagination, to actually protect this unique landscape as an inhabited space, not only by herders, but also by free-roaming buffalo and their many companions.
Climavore, therefore, believes that this new multi-species approaches to food landscapes can highlight the cultural and ecological value of species and spaces that are being pressed to extinction. And if so, how can we also secure ecologies through actions promoting free movement in common land to carry on with pastoralist practices? How can certain ingredients support legal efforts and policy making to make sure roaming populations can stay empowered and in place, keeping their environments wet and murky?
And the preservation of buffalo herding shows us the importance of soil, animal, shepherd interactions, resisting intensive farming while challenging the enclosure of the commons, and newly imposed national borders in their crossing.
To do that, we opened Chamuralem, which is a milk shop, a dessert milk shop, that has been a very common typology across the city of Istanbul for decades and decades. Yet today, there are only 3 of these shops that exist. In order to open the shop, the first thing we needed are containers or vessels to be serving yogurt, kaymak, muhalabi, and sutlach. And in order to create them, we dug a wallow for the buffaloes on the outskirts of the city. Harvesting the clay from the wallow, we created these 1,000 pots that you can see here in the image, basically to serve these different desserts. Then in these vessels kind of were brought into the shop that became also the space to bring together all of the research and metabolic interactions that Daniel was mentioning before. So how do we think about the different botanical species and plants that the buffalo graze on, and kind of the way their saliva fertiles the soil? How do we think about or bring together the different ethnomusicological history around buffalo through a soundtrack of the shop that brings together more than 40 songs in different Anatolian languages: Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, Bulgarian, and Turkish, all kind of depicting or kind of tracing the significance of buffaloes and their culture for various communities and ethnicities.
And as part of Water Buffalo Commons, the project at the Climavore X Jamil at RCA initiative, we've also continued the conversations with herders, trying to map the encroaching infrastructures, but also thinking about these grazing corridors. And as part of that, also, we created an annual celebration of the Buffalo Festival, which we started last year. It was the first edition, and it's celebrated in one of the villages. And it kind of uses the buffalo diplomacy, if you want, to bring together the herders with the chefs, the restaurants, the museums, local politicians, to ensure that the future of the wetlands is a diverse cultural ecosystem where buffaloes are at the center of a vast web of interactions across multiple species. How are we doing with time? Sorry, Daniel? We're good. Okay.
Yes, we continue. Seasons.
Yeah, okay, you still have half an hour? No, 50 minutes. Yeah, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Half an hour, sorry, half an hour. Yeah. Whoops.
Okay. Good. Okay. Oranges require orange to be. They are a color expectation. If an orange is not an orange, it is no orange.
Oranges originated in China, where they were crossbred from a mandarin and a pomelo as early as the 4th century before Christ. From there, oranges passed from Sanskrit through Persian and its Arabic derivative. Traveling with the Moors, naranjas soon dotted Al-Andalus and Sicily. Oranges arrived in England from France in the 14th century, their bright skins holding the taste of a color that became popular in markets, on palates, and eventually in tongue.
For centuries, oranges were orange, and still orange was not a color. It was called yellow-red. It took another 200 years for the color to earn its name, to become a form that could give itself to others, to be ascribed to flowers, stones, minerals, and the setting sun.
To the west, oranges followed the path of Spanish missionaries to the Americas and lent their name to Orange County and the Orange State. In California, the fruit fed the miners of the gold rush who passed through mission towns. In Florida, there were so many groves that by 1893, the state was producing 5 million boxes of fruit each year. In this tropical climate, nights too humid and too hot, oranges would ripen too quickly. They were ready to be eaten while still green. And so, from the 20th century onwards, green oranges have been synthetically dyed orange, coated to match consumer expectations. Oranges reveal that humans cannot imagine a species detached from its color, even when we are the ones who detach it. This is the origin story of what Hisano calls the capitalism of the senses, the management of food color as a business practice, often invisible to consumers in order to correct natural variations, as she remarks. The color of food is not merely a physiological characteristic, but a contested terrain where nature and technology intersect. Business interests, government regulations, and consumer expectations compete, and taste and sight are intertwined.
Amid all the observations that are made about industrialization and its consequences, the following is rarely heard. The world's colors are shifting. We grow up coloring pictures of the world. Trees are green, oceans blue, and yolks yellow. That everything else in life is turned regularly upside down is only tolerable because oranges remain orange and the sky blue. An increasing amount of industrial energy is directed, therefore, towards dyeing the world in natural colors so that life and commerce may proceed.
but dyes may miss their mark. Shifting cues in flesh, scales, skin, leaves, wings, feathers are clues to the environmental and metabolic metamorphosis around and inside us. The force that is color is not for domestication. It is fugitive. Color colors outside our lines. As Esther Leslie puts it, color is fragile and contingent. Color is fleeting, fugitive, unstable, more attuned to the memory than to the objective world, always escaping or slipping away, fading as night falls or when the sun shines too brightly. Chemists struggle to make it last. Color is motile. And in the realm of color, chemical color, synthetic color, nothing remains the same as it was yesterday.
In 2018, an eye-catching sparrow was spotted on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. The sparrow was bright pink.
We know that sparrows are supposed to look like because they have evolved with us. Over several millennia, food scraps from human settlements attracted sparrows from the wild, which mutated into a new species. House sparrows have since become a familiar sight wherever humans dwell. They metabolize the sage of our settlements into their brown-gray feathers. They are drabber than their older tree sparrow cousins, who preserve the brighter tones of the forest.
The pink sparrow, neither forest nor house, was a color leak. The sparrow had turned salmon.
We grew up coloring in pictures of the world. Trees are green, sky is blue, orange is orange, and salmon, salmon. Yet since the advent of industrialism, color has been moving. It fades and it is fed. It signals environmental shifts.
On the Pacific coast of Mexico, shrimp caught in the Chacagua Lagoon have stopped turning red as they cook. Chemical sediments from papaya plantations upstream bleach the shrimp shells, stripping them of their red.
In the Philippines, pollution has destroyed the red food shrimp feed on. Instead, they starve in blue. Heavy metals blacken their gills. Parasites strangles their ovaries in white, choking their heads in yellow.
Shrimp, 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 but no longer look like shrimp. Unreadable, unedible, unreadable shrimp signal a chemical reorganization of water and the life within it. Shrimp's failure to color shows us the tones of water chemistry imbalance, species misrecognition, failed courtship, infertility, lack of camouflage, and all in all, the impossibility of a shrimp survival.
So many toxic substances are circulating through bodies that bodies may actually be the ones circulating through chemicals, not the other way around. Instead of bodies metabolizing color, color is now metabolizing bodies.
The salmon sparrow in Skye was a warning signal. A body consumed by the color of another species, a red flag.
In the 1980s, frog populations began to die at an alarming rate. Before dying, the frog legs would grow inflamed, turning red. Color was swelling their skin. The frogs were ingesting PCB toxins that made their immune systems more vulnerable. PCBs have no color themselves, but when metabolized, they cause color.
Pigs that live in forests have darker skin for camouflage. When pigs were domesticated and stopped fearing predators, they evolved into a hairless pink. Pigs were cursed into pig, and like wild salmon, black pigs were classed as a new wild species.
Swine megafarms collect hog feces, urine, blood, and other bodily fluids in lagoons. Bright pink anaerobic bacteria added to break down the sludge turns the lagoon pig. Wherever hog farms proliferate, Water turns high-density animal feedlot, a radiant pig.
A bright pink foam runs from textile factories in India's Yamuna River, making the produce that grows in fields nearby taste fast fashion.
In Mumbai, fast fashion metabolized 11 dog bodies who swam in the Kasadi River. They turned blue. Dogs that swim in must-wear color rivers become must-wear color dogs.
The bodies of pig, frog, shrimp, sparrow, dog, and salmon circulate through astaxanthin, sludge, PCBs, fabric dyes, and heavy metals. We might not be looking at pig, frog, shrimp, sparrow, dog, or salmon anymore. It is color that is blinking at us.
This is the chromatmosphere, in which color is a species we consume, and where color species live.
At the ends of the Earth, the chromatmosphere shows signs of a new bipolar order. In the Arctic, air losing transparency due to suspended chemicals distorting the trajectory of sunlight is snow. Ocean water pollutants accumulated in fat is fading seal skin. What seems like rusty snow is parasites thriving in rising polar temperatures. The Arctic is not Arctic white any longer.
In the Antarctic, the snow is pink, but less so than before. Penguin poo is pink as penguins feed on astaxanthin-rich krill. But as krill are overfished, penguin colonies are losing their characteristic tone. The snow remains snow white even after penguin droppings are deposited on its surface. In the Antarctic, it snows krill depletion.
Along the east coast of the US, yellow-feathered birds have begun to mold crimson. Like the salmon sparrow in the sky, their body color and their species color no longer align. As temperatures rise, red berries now proliferate in their local habitat.
When woodpeckers and waxwing feed on the once uncommon honeysuckle berries, they metabolize a red pigment that alters the color of their feathers. When yellow woodpeckers feather invasive berry, we can tell that berries are turning rising temperature.
Brooklyn had an incredibly hot summer in 2010. Flowers and blossoms withered, and hives in the area began to glow incandescent red. Starving bees had resorted to non-floral food sources, and as the Brooklyn bees fed on cherry syrup from a nearby factory, Red 40 petrochemical colorant metabolized bees, honey, and hive.
Flamingos raised in captivity lack access to astaxanthin-rich algae, so zoos feed them flamingo to keep up with visitor expectation. Just as farmed salmon, flamingo.
In the meantime, the algae that give flamingos their distinctive salmon color are the latest wonder ingredient in human beauty products. You can now flamingo your skin, hair, and nails. Bodies have become filtering devices. Humans and animals are disposable hosts for synthetic color. Humans struggle to imagine a species detached from its color, even if when we are the ones who detach it. Shifting hues in flesh, scales, skin, and feathers are clues to the metabolic metamorphoses around and inside us.
Life in the chromatmospheres denies salmon the right to their own colors. As diets and desires transform plant and animal bodies, we need to learn the struggle of living with and within color. After all, we color the chromatmosphere, and the world is already saturated. Salmon is the color of a wild fish that is neither wild nor fish, nor even salmon.
And these color stories we compiled in Salmon and Red Herring, which was an exhibition we did at Tate Britain, and that, as we were saying, was tracing all these color glitches, like the chromatmosphere, how we called it, how we can trace the problems of the climate emergency, like the intensive salmon farms that are polluting not only the environment, but every single body. Here you can see how these salmon farms are. This is from footage from Skye in Scotland, where these pens that above water you can barely see anything happening. Underwater is open nets that are raising 1 to 2 million salmon in captivity. That has tremendous consequences, not only for wild species or wild counterparts, but also in terms of the pollution, chemicals, pigment that they leach into the waters around them. Also, the feed that goes into the making fish look salmon contributes to the disappearance of many landscapes of extraction all over the world to produce those ingredients that are kind of feeding the fish. And so also because of the fish growing in captivity, you get all these different diseases and lice.
In response to season of polluted seas from salmon farms, we have been working for the past 7 years on the Isles of Skye and Raasay to divest away from extractive aquaculture and develop an alternative aquacultures for these islands. The first action we took was to build a multi-species underwater intertidal table, a home for oysters, mussels, and seaweeds that all filter the water at high tide. And then at low tide, when the table emerges above the sea, it becomes a space for humans to come together and develop and kind of debate alternative aquacultures for the island.
Here you can see images from high tide and low tide and the different workshops that we've been organizing since 2007, when we launched the project in the intertidal zone with residents, divers, all kinds of groups to discuss those alternative imaginaries. As part of the program of the climate forestation in Skye and Raasay, which is directed by Shauna Cameron, we have a whole stream of pedagogy. On the one hand, collaborating with restaurants that have removed farm salmon from their menu and introduced climate dishes made with basically seaweeds and bivalves that filter the water as they grow, but also collaborating with schools on training the next generation of cooks on that kind of climavore diet. For instance, with scallops and other bivalves that have been traditionally a very common ingredient, but over the past couple of generations have been a bit forgotten from the diet.
This also comes together with a program of literacy workshops of the intertidal zone, trying to connect basically school children and various groups to kind of this liminal space and look at the opportunity and the cultural and environmental history of that space that has been kind of a key to the both culture, the history, and the ecology of the islands and the highlands of Scotland at large.
So here you can see images of different workshops that have been conducted, surveys to understand the biodiversity of the intertidal. Another stream is also connecting to that through the lens of marine biology and how to think of intertidal farms, almost like sea orchards, you could say, where these different ingredients could be cultivated as a multi-species habitat instead of an intensive aquaculture, like salmon farms that requires medicines, pigments, etc. But here through a vision for these multiple species grown together. And that's the growing part.
And the last stream that we are developing through this project is rebuilding, basically looking at material that emerges out of the intertidal zone and how also to harness waste streams that are generated through the climavore restaurants that we're working with. Here you see examples on the island of Lesso in Denmark, where eelgrass has been used for centuries, basically, to build these roofs on the left, and on the right, a contemporary version of those of these roofs and of this typology that is kind of being adapted and advanced to kind of contemporary architectural techniques.
And these are different case studies and typologies that we are compiling and meeting also different craftspeople making them to also incorporate them into a curriculum that we started in collaboration with the school in Portree on the island, in Skye, to think of these materials of intertidal origin used as construction materials, not only as ingredients. Other case studies, for instance, is in Guangzhou in south of China, where facades of different houses have been literally made with oyster shells instead of bricks. And here also is applying that to the process we've been doing in Skye by collecting the shells, the waste from the restaurants we collaborate with, cleaning them, sorting them, and crushing them.
As we mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, the space of the restaurant for us is a crucial space to think about how to transform ecologies and bodies. And over the past years, we have collaborated with more than 11 restaurants on the Isle of Skye and more than 20 museums all across in restaurants and cafes in museums across the UK to remove salmon off their menu and introduce climavore dishes instead. Many of these dishes and recipes use oysters, mussels, and scallops. And kind of through this process of collecting the waste shell, we're kind of thinking how to transform them into a new material, and by that, regenerate an alternative and regenerative economy and ecology for the island.
These are images of the process that we've been developing a new material without cement, which is one of the most polluting materials of the contemporary construction sector. So thinking of a building material that uses the food waste from the restaurants, here turned into lime, all these different shells, and also aggregate. So it's sort of terrazzo, but made without cement and without resin. So it takes the shape of a tile. These were the first tests we developed a few years ago. This is another test we did with colleagues in Taiwan that also making contemporary the technique that they have in terms of mortar, which mixes shells, rice, and sugar, and that creates this glutinous binding agent. And these are some images of the first 400 tiles that we made for an installation at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh last year. And here is the latest piece, which was finished last week, and is a series of murals that we are making. They're like bivalve murals. They have a mirror twin, like bivalves, and they kind of through that series we're working with different collecting institutions or museums to acquire one of the sites, and the other will stay on the island. And the idea is that with that process, fundraise for a workshop to be built on the island to continue producing the material and basically recycling or reusing the waste seashells from restaurants.
Eating in the 21st century needs to happen within an ecosystem. But in the climate emergency, the English term ecosystem, first coined by the botanist Arthur Tansley in the mid-1930s, but so intrinsic in so many ancestral indigenous beliefs across the world, needs to be revisited, especially when extractivism has mostly broken the links and relations between organisms. If we no longer know what system to go back to, how do we test out other possible forms of equilibrium for the environment without displacing human and non-human bodies? How do we unlearn decades of limitless growth and yields on steroids?
Considerable amount of scientific research has focused on the future of farming. Many farmers themselves are the first ones interested in saving costs from created dependencies on unnecessary agrochemicals. But this is, of course, not enough. The culture of eating also needs to radically change in parallel for the landscape, not only in people's kitchens, but also in collective eating spaces and platforms with the public component where infrastructural change can happen, especially in urban contexts where bodies have been more and more disconnected from the origins of food.
Climavore engages at all levels with our metabolic pathways, considering the sequence of chemical reactions in living and non-living organisms involved in what the world eats. Metabolism, in this sense, is a tool that allows us to see, feel, taste, smell, hear the climate emergency at all possible scales, from our gut to the edges of the planet. It is also a journey to reimagine our role as humans and the seasons we don't want to live by in changing climates.
The different seasons we presented today, from drought, wetland draining, or moving deserts, or polluted coasts, are some of these new seasons that are emerging today. But the responsibility for planetary collapse cannot only rely on individual choices. And that's why we want to dismantle preconceived ideas and fixed understandings of seasonality to develop other sensibilities that follow the new terms of the climate crisis at the end of seasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. You can hear me, right? I just don't want feedback to happen here. So if it happens, I'll just switch off the microphone here and you talk. Okay, so who goes first?
You please, you
Yeah.
the microphone in your hand.
So Daniel and Alan, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. What could I say? There's just so much happening here in terms of well, you're both trained as architects, as I understand, or not? And I was writing some. No, actually, I was trying to look for your personal bios, because it's you teach at the Royal College of London in an architectural environment, and from an outside point of view, a lot of people could ask, like, is this an architectural kind of practice that you're doing, for example? For me, it's clear. So this is just why I wanted to understand what you were doing, because I have some questions related to you in how you work with your students, for example, in terms of your own practice as cooking sections, because there's something happening inside academia, in teaching students, in doing research, but also outside in these usually mostly cultural environments. This would be maybe first one question. In your presentation, you don't present forms of representation that are traditional from architecture, maps, drawings, sections. You present it, but you're not drawing these kinds of you're not making yourself these kinds of representations. Maybe you do it as a process, I would say, but you're not presenting them. But on the other sense, you're studying so many scales, from the landscape scale, from the speak territorial scales, from the material scale, you go to the scale of the material, from the cultural scale, this idea of policy making. I would say that most of your work is about policy making. So one question I'm interested in is how I think a lot of people in the field of architecture have been feeling kind of desperate, because we produce a lot of knowledge, we make a lot of things visible, but in the end, this information things don't pass to policy making. But actually, in your presentation, you're doing policy making. It might seem simple to change a menu in a restaurant, but actually, it's a big thing, and it crosses through all this research that goes from the environment. So one question would be how how do you do this, and how do you teach this to students, and that this could follow? I think I heard once in a podcast by you a long time ago, I'm not sure if I'm mistaken, but you would put students running for funding, for example, to create their own projects, for example. And this, for me, it's interesting because it's looking for funding as an architectural tool, I would say, of change, of making policy making. That would be one. I think that's enough for now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, great. I think it's really a wonderful kind of entry point, kind of for the discussion, kind of a really kind of a reflection basically on methodology, I would say, and on the way kind of we develop the practice and the way we practice. And I think is something that has to do a lot, I think, with the questions that interest us, and also with the reason of like why we have focused our practice on the question of food. And I think for us, kind of to start with the latter is really to acknowledge the fact, I think, from our perspective, that food is an intersectional tool and it's an interscalar tool. It's a way to understand how the world is constructed, and it's a way to kind of navigate between all of these scales that you mentioned and many more, right? Because I think it's also really important to think about the scale of the body and the scale of the cells in the body, right? And also the scale of the landscape, like on the landscape again, from like thinking about the planet as a space that is in ecological crisis, but also all of these different bodies that kind of constitute the planet, right? From like the multiplicity of species that inhabit the earth to like tiny organisms that we like never account for in this process. Yet all of them kind of, when we talk about, right, ecosystems, when we talk about landscape, when we talk about environment, these all, and this is of course something, I'm saying something that is extremely obvious, but like, of course, all of these kind of species are what kind of constitutes life on Earth. And how kind of, and I think this is where this becomes like a very architectural question, like architectural in the sense of like spatial question. Like when we're thinking about questions of design, when we're thinking about questions of like addressing the climate crisis, we have to be kind of running or like moving and kind of addressing all of these different scales at once, right? And then I think comes the question of like, what are the tools that we have to do that? And second, what are the methodologies at hand to do that? And what do we need kind of to change? What do we need to design if we want to, you know, like if to use the language of like design, like what do we need to design or what do we need to address in that process? And I think that really kind of comes back, I think, to the question of like, what do we need to design today? We need to design, from our perspective, cultural shifts, and we need to design kind of policy, like infrastructural transformation. That the way to do that like runs many times through kind of the vehicle of policy making. So I think this is where all of this kind of becomes for us in a very, you know, like without designing buildings necessarily, right? Like this idea of like transforming space or kind of constructing space is at the core of like everything we do and the way we think. And then I think that there's a whole question that comes out of the, like, what are the modes of representation, like, to do that, right? And what are like the kind of the cultural tools, if kind of in a traditional sense, you know, of like architecture, we had like the plan in the section, like what are the kind of the modes of representation that we need today to address kind of the urgent questions of our time?
This one?
Okay.
Ah.
All right. Now you're looking at my back. That's not good.
You can talk.
So thank you so much, David and Alon. I love that. A very big fan of your work, and it's wonderful to see you or meet you at least in the framework of this conference. I also had a kind of a methodological question. I couldn't help noticing, or let's say for me, it seems like your work has such a high impact and yet you're working with these very fragile systems and environments to start with, and perhaps there's an evolution from maybe an installation of, incredible, fascinating depth of research, but an installation at the Manifesta in Palermo or something like that, relatively simple, but it seems to have developed all sorts of channels that go out and make incredible impact, going as far as these policy and things like this, but also you're adding new layers all the time. So this, the Buffalo Festival and music and things like this, which seem to have reaching into, a very broad range, or at least that's how it appears, of society, which is exactly what we need to make this, transitional shift. So I was kind of wondering if, what is it that means that you have this impact where you reach a broader audience with this work than we possibly as normal architects, although I must say I've had my students making seaweed roofs, also inspired by this work in Denmark. So it's wonderful to see that again. So is it the cultural production? Do we have to look at that broader? Is it the narratives that you design around these activities or these installations? How would you, now that you know all you know and had gained all this experience, what would your advice be to gain, higher impact with the work, because the situation is urgent?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think from our side, what we try to do is to engage with people already doing incredible work in the different places we're invited to, and to get in touch with them, from cooperatives to like scientists to residents. There's always people doing interesting work, and the what we try to do as part of the methodology, if you want, is to build on those efforts, or to try to join forces or collaborate, or to amplify what they are already doing. And I think even if different projects start very, very small, what we believe in is to try to continue those conversations as much as possible, because maybe, yes, there's an installation that lasts for a few months, but then you need to fight and figure out how to continue the research or the conversations or the structure, or like all that material. How can that continue over time? And to continue, you need more allies. You need to find new forms of kinship. You need to find more sources of funding. You need to find new friends, and by doing that, also pushes the project in new ways that you were not anticipating, or one does not anticipate. So I think, yeah, it's on the one hand quite organically, but at the same time very carefully planned, because you need to keep taking steps and persuading people that is important to continue that work.
And I think in parallel to that, there's also a question of like the role of, and I think it's something we've kind of spoke about a bit during the presentation, like the role of culture in kind of this process, right? And I think the role of cultural institutions, and I think like also I want to kind of think about cultural institution in its context in a very broad sense of cultural institutions, right? Like the obvious ones that we often collaborate with are museums, or like different kind of cultural organizations, or like biennials, et cetera, but that could be, like the way kind of we think or want to think about culture is something that is like very broad. It could be extended to like universities. It could be extended to like various grassroots movements and initiatives. It could be extended to like farmers cooperatives and so on and so forth. And how do we kind of use these platforms, right? The spaces that kind of hold kind of or that are constructed as space kind of for knowledge production and kind of sharing, as spaces also of like bringing kind of people together in order to kind of create these like active transformation. So I think this is like where I think over the past years we've kind of, as we have been thinking more and more about kind of the agency of the work, and as we have been thinking more and more about kind of the processual nature of it, and how we have to kind of work over like periods of time in order to see this kind of infrastructural change. Also how like the space of culture and cultural production becomes like not only a space of like reflection or a space to kind of a representation of ideas, but like a space of action, right? The space of like really kind of using, like using the cultural infrastructure in order to transform different aspects of society, of like ecological questions, of pedagogy, and so on and so forth.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's a question of coherence and ethics with your practice. So if you make an exhibition about how eating salmon is so bad, and having these institutions selling salmon, feeding people with salmon on their menus, it doesn't make sense. And that's the question of our position as architects, as artists, in relation to the project and in this institution in which we are getting involved to. And one thing I find curious when looking at your website and the projects you're involved, is there's always a position of co-authorship in all your projects. So Klimavar, although it's a project that was, this term was coined by you, but it's a thing that's bigger and you're part of it. And I think it's very easy to get mixed between all these people that are involved. So it's not you as, I don't know if you would like to.
It's agency.
If your agency, yeah, if you have, if this is something that's, I think it's, you think about it, of course, but maybe the way you present yourselves in your projects, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. For us, yeah, it's very important because of also the nature of the different works. One needs a lot of collaborators and as new ways of working, and it's impossible to do the work one person or two people or three people. I think is that network of approximations and different parts that get put together also over time, and some people continue doing more things, other people kind of join for a certain aspects, more or less technical of the project. But I think we see it quite as an organic, let's say, cloud or platform where also even some of the projects can be taken and can have a life of their own without us.
Yeah, and more than that, I think in the case of Klimavar, also it's really thought of as a platform, right? I think it's like putting forward a question that I think we find really urgent, and it's a proposition and a methodology that we hope that like people, communities, organizations can use, right? And can kind of come on board and be part of in order to expand not the reach of Klimavar as a term or as a concept, but like as a methodology of like actually like how do we address the climate crisis? And as you just mentioned, this is like an extremely urgent question, and like we just don't have time, right? And it's like I think by that kind of there isn't a possibility to like hold the knowledge in a way, or like like and say like this is something that like we have to develop. It's something that like as we're developing, we need to have like more and more kind of people taking this on, right, and kind of pushing it forward. Again, that's I think goes back also to the questions of pedagogy and like why we teach, right, and kind of why this is also a pedagogical practice, because it's like it's not about only giving students like a methodology or a way to think about like what is urgent today for our practice, what does it mean to be an architect today, like what is spatial practice and so on and so forth. But it's like actually inviting people to go and like develop this work that I think we kind of or kind of to think together with us, and how do we address like a planet like on the brink of collapse.
Mm-hmm. So now I'll pass to the audience. You have one camera, right? The screen with the audience. So let's see if you can listen to the question. Okay, it will be in the speakers.
Thank you so much for the incredible presentation. São Paulo, Brazil.
It's a bit hard
We-
for us to hear. Sorry.
We can't hear the question.
You
Can
can,
you hear? No?
no, you
Daniel,
can't.
we hear you
can't
very
hear it.
well, but the second mic.
Okay, but we'll lose the. So who wants to make questions?
They need seats
Come to
here.
the stage.
Yeah,
Yes.
technical problems.
Can you hear me? Oh. that's-
Yeah.
Please have this seat.
Hi, thank you so much for a great presentation. And my question to you is related to the concept of care. I see what you are presenting to us, is a very big and systemic way of seeking care system, not only of, the planet, but also the care of every single life that we have. And I would like, to you, please, if you could elaborate a little more. And it's very important to address young kids as you are doing. That is the target, because our students are mature adults, okay? But you are going down to where things start. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you do. I love it. Go to Brazil, please.
You have to find some cows or some.
Yeah.
You have some few
We have many. We have biodiversity. Bye.
Thank you for the comment and question. Yeah, I think for us is also a big question that, yeah, many people talk about care, but it's very hard, and we question ourselves a lot, and yeah, you just try different ways of handling things and how to think of that from a more sensitive perspective. Yes, you were saying across generations or across species, across forms of life and non-life. But it's also a learning process for us.
Yeah, and I think the only kind of, again, it's like, I think how to really put these things into practice. And I think this is what we kind of go back to over and over again. And I think, as Daniel just mentioned, they're the very kind of obvious aspects of it. Like, oh, you do an exhibition about the impact of farmed salmon on the environment. Like, it's impossible that like a museum will be serving salmon in the cafe at the same time, right? And we just have to, there's like a set of like ethics and kind of practices that we just have to institute as kind of spatial practitioners, while at the same time to really kind of hold ourselves, I think, first and foremost accountable to these processes, and not to, as we see today, and I think also the idea or concept of care, right, that kind of is almost becoming a new idea of sustainability, right? And like a term that is kind of being used so kind of naturally and casually, but like, how are we actually instituting these practices, and how we kind of really create infrastructures of care that runs through generations, species, spaces, and so forth.
Who wants to make a question more?
You have
Okay.
to come. But they should sit here, Daniel, because.
Yeah, and
they-
then the person who comes.
No, the
cool.
person who comes, somebody could sit.
So I'll leave
Because-
the seat here. That way they can see them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
you-
Thank you.
Hello. So, thank you very much for the presentation, just like everyone else. I was amazing. It's great to see you sort of live. So, my question is regarding the beauty, in a sense of beauty as a tool for survival, and in a sense of dryness and desert aesthetics not being beautiful because we somehow do not associate dryness in many senses. And then thinking about these spaces as some sort of unpleasant and therefore worth to be eradicated from the world. This is what is happening in these deserted areas. And maybe you have thought as well how aesthetical takes also contribute to the sort of Darwinian natural selection of survival of certain landscapes, but also in a beauty sense of food things, not just landscapes as such. And then you started talking about this new kind of beautiful, which we don't understand as beautiful colored landscapes, which leave one very uncomfortable, but could be also understood as some sort of new kind of beauty. And my final point in this, as a question is there any ways, or have you thought of any ways, strategies to change the way we see not beautiful as beautiful, to turn sort of ugly into beautiful? Because like the food is beautified, we are beautified, landscapes are beautified, and so this kind of strange balance we are living in, or we've always lived in, just this very strange level at a given moment.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think, yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we use that word like beauty in our work or during the process. I think especially, if anything, there's a lot of ugliness with these landscapes, and I think that's what we're trying to do with tracing color, how to understand those gradients of ugliness that in a way can be helpful to understand the processes that are behind them. And if we extrapolate to other binaries of like not beauty, ugly, but clean or dirty, is also something that we try to question or to avoid, not to be stuck in these binaries of what is clean, what is dirty, because there's many degrees of contamination, and perhaps also equivalent with the process of aesthetic appearance. There's many degrees and values on how to judge that. With toxicity, we tend to embrace the different degrees of toxicity because we don't think there's a level of purity at all. It's no longer possible. There's always some sort of contamination or pollution by certain substance. So I think it's also what we try to do is to unlearn a lot of these binaries and to think of much more fluid states or states that are at odds with each other, to make us question or ask why is so or less contaminated, or why these colors appear, or why these phenomena are making things not look as one would expect. Don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's how we would see it.
You say I answer. It's a yes. There's a question? No. There. Maybe you said, or if you want to come, if not, I can ask the question here.
Yeah.
It's you, yeah.
Yeah.
You want to ask a question? Yeah. Is there a mic? Let's try to put it loud, so I think it might work. It works, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear? No.
more or less. Let's try.
Let's try. And
Say if it doesn't pass, I'll add it.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. So I have a question that extends a bit the question of the real agency. And I'm coming from Bulgaria, because we actually research in factories. And my question is based on my own experience, on what you said related to using cultural space to create action. So I had this question of, can you eat local tomatoes? Because I found out that tomatoes are
actually the Turkey, etc. So we had to start with business actually in order to answer this question. And you showed a lot of issues that you are a part of them. And I was wondering to what extent do you follow them, to what extent do you cite them, and is it a long-term process? Or is it something that you at one point give up? And how do you give it up? Yeah, on your engagement with all of those you showed today.
Daniel, can you? We heard like part keywords, but not the full question. If Daniel, you can.
Yeah, I think I got all.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll just try and summarize. Please tell me
Yeah.
if I'm missing something.
Yeah.
So the question came from a researcher in Bulgaria who was asking about how you follow up on these processes, how much you were involved, and then at some point you leave them to run their own, and because there seem to be many different projects running. And did you ask also how you initiate them?
No, I understood, but in a certain way, when you're supposed to practice to create space of action, it's also a responsibility that you have to work in a way to follow up or to.
How do you deal with the space of responsibility and kind of like, well, to use the word sustainability, but anyway, how to make sure that project stays alive?
Or is it an interest, or how do they give this sort of ethics of responsibility to work?
Right, the ethics of responsibility. Is it part of your
Yeah.
interest?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really, really important question. Maybe I'll try to answer it in a bit of a processual way. So, until now, all of the, and perhaps, I mean, in the future as well, but until now, the projects that we have been leading under Climavore and with our practice always begin with an invitation of a cultural institution, and that is quite important for us. That from the beginning, there's basically an organization that is on the ground, right? That is kind of connected to various kind of individuals, communities, groups that can start working with us to set up this kind of structure through which a transformative process can take place. And I think over the years, I mean, I think, and now it has become like really a core part of our practice, but it didn't start that way. And I think this is something maybe we won't have enough time to get into it today, but I think there's a whole evolution in our practice for that. Is how do you kind of really think about these ecological processes, right? And ecological transformations, and something that cannot last the duration of an exhibition or a kind of a traditional project within kind of the cultural landscape that we inhabit. So how do we kind of think about practicing on ecological time, and what does it mean to kind of run a project then that would last for like 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years? And what kind of mechanisms and methodologies one has to put in place to start doing that. And I think a big part then becomes exactly as I think you were pointing out, very rightly so. It's like, how do we kind of develop agency, and how do we bring kind of agents into the process that could hold the process and carry the process on, because this is not something we can do. And I think different projects that we're involved with are at different stages, and according to the kind of geography and kind of situation on the ground and the partners, etc., this takes like different forms. So I could say, you know, with the project on Sky, which is the kind of longest lasting project that started in 2016, it started through an invitation from a local arts organization. Then we opened up we set up a local organization that is run by like a local team that is kind of directing the program, and more, you know, like as time goes by, I mean, we are there to support, I would say, the process, and kind of provide any kind of tools, ideas, you know, collaborations, partnerships, conversations that are useful. Yet at the same time, kind of the lead and the day-to-day kind of is more and more taken kind of over by different kind of members of the community on Sky and Rasai. And I think that is something that is kind of, then when you talk about the sustainability, it becomes also like a driving force to really think about these programs that like at the beginning are very heavily reliant on kind of grant making, like fundraising of like various forms, etc. But then how do you also develop kind of economic models and kind of practices that would enable the projects to kind of have a long life that is independent and kind of can benefit also all of the different people that are involved with them.
I think, yeah, we're running out of time. So that's it. I got a red flag. Daniel and Ellen, thank you very much for sharing your work with us today. I hope this brings resonances for everybody. And although you're not here, I'm sure what you presented will keep on the discussions on the following days and the several papers that will be presented in the conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us, everyone. Thank you.